Well, Mouth, what is going on, my man?
Listen, I was never the CEO of Blockbuster, but I do appreciate the fact that I did spend a lot of time with Blockbuster, and long before I even started working for Blockbuster, I worked for them for 20 years. I was a movie geek before that, and I'm a movie geek ever since. So yeah, what's up? What's going on, Pete?
Pretty good, brother. Pretty good. You know what? Before we move on, I have to say, if I had to pick between going to Blockbuster or Hollywood Video, I went to Blockbuster all the time. I
Oh
gotta
hell
admit,
yeah, you did.
yeah. I stepped in a Hollywood Video maybe less than a dozen times because that was the only one when I was going to college. They didn't have Blockbuster in that area, and that was
Look,
rare.
the only reason to go to Hollywood Video is what they had over Blockbuster is, well, they had corn. I mean, that's what they had. Like, they didn't have nearly as many movies, but they did have that section behind the curtains that you could go to that Blockbuster never had. So
Didn't
there's that.
what's called? Didn't Blockbuster? Good, I'm listening.
Go, I didn't hear. I didn't say anything. Yep.
Oh, okay. Didn't Blockbuster also have a little adult section too at one point?
No,
I
no,
thought they did.
no. They were always the family video store.
Okay. I thought they did for some reason. Maybe I'm mistaken. Hey,
Yeah.
I've been wrong before 100 times.
No, they never did. They never did.
Oh. 80's. Come on, talk to me, brother.
80's.
I know you.
It's the greatest. It's the greatest decade of movies ever.
Oh, I totally agree. I'm not going to argue there. I think it was one of the best eras because you had. I can name two movies off my head, both are blockbusters, and trying to argue with me. I don't think you're going to even think about arguing with me. We got Top Gun and Ghostbusters right there off the bat.
Yeah, I mean, sure. But look, what made the 80's so great is you like the 80's were the you have to consider what the prologue to the 80's was, and the prologue to the 80's was the 70's, right? And the 70's were known for gritty.
Kelly, before we move on, let me get the Mr. President in here. Let's get his theme song going.
President's in. There's the president. Salute.
What is going on, Paul? How are you, brother?
Yeah, it's good to see you guys.
Hey, man, Paul. What's up, buddy?
It's all good, man. It's all good.
Yep. Kelly, I'm sorry for cutting you off. Go ahead. Finish what you're saying. I apologize.
So the 80's, right? The 70's were the prologue to the 80's, right? And the 70's were filled with, gritty, realistic, down-to-earth films. You had The Godfather. You had The Godfather 2. You had, The French Connection. You had even when you started getting fantastical, you had Jaws, right? The first blockbuster, first summer blockbuster there ever was, right? As you moved into the 80's, all of a sudden they changed the formula. All of a sudden you had rewatchability. Like, how much can you go back and watch this movie over and over again? They had a creative freedom. The 70's had a creative license. The 80's had this creative freedom that came along. You had the advent of special effects that you'd never seen before. So, all of a sudden you had films like Back to the Future. You had E.T., you had Raiders of the Lost Ark, all these films that had these great special effects on top of the fact that you had really great storylines to go with it and great heroes to go with it. And so, you get the 80's, and I mean, I'd argue some of the best films. I don't care what the genre is. You look at drama, you look at war movies. Drama, you had Sophie's Choice. War movies, you had Platoon. Action, you had Raiders of the Lost Ark. Drama, you had Out of Africa and Chariots of Fire. Sci-fi, you had Aliens. Family adventure, you had E.T. You name it, and you had it in the 80's. And one of the other things I would add is, how many movies from the 80's can you quote a line from one of their movies? versus
Too many. That's a problem.
Right. Right. Like how many? Like you could quote movies from the 70s, quote tons of
Not
movies
really.
from the 80s. But when you start moving into the 90s and the 2000s, like what movies are you quoting? Maybe some Ron Burgundy, some comedies and that kind of thing. But you're not quoting a lot of other stuff. And that's why I hold that the 80s was the greatest decade. Comedy? Oh my God. John Hughes was in his
Prime.
He's in his prime, right? Yeah. I mean, you have Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, Breakfast Club. I mean, come on. You have some of the greatest comedies. And it was funny. I was talking to a buddy of mine today about this, and you can make arguments for a lot of different genres, but I would argue that the 80s was the greatest decade for comedy. They knew how to write comedy. They knew how to tell the story of comedy. They knew how to end a skit. They didn't take one little bit and create it into an entire movie. They had entire movies that were filled with skits. And so yeah, I love the movie. I love the 80s. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I definitely think it was arguably the most influential decade, possibly in history, especially when it came to the arts. I think a lot of it had to do with the times. Obviously, you were talking about the 70s earlier that gave birth to the 80s. That was a very tumultuous time. That was Watergate. That was the end of the Vietnam War. That was where people really started questioning, to a broad extent, their government. So I think that environment gave people, I think, license to be more expressive, I think, in the 80s. In the 70s, you kind of had that balance between the old and the new, and there was a lot of social upheavals that were still carrying on, certainly since the 60s. In the 70s, it got fleshed out, and again, people really started to look at things a little bit differently. And I think you got that sort of that new rebel attitude in the 80s. So some of the movies that you mentioned, like The Breakfast Club, like 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller, whatnot, that kind of that rebellious, middle finger to society or to authority, so to speak. I think it certainly got us. I think it really sort of took off in the 80s. You also had the Cold War going on. It at its height. Like I was maybe too young in the 70s to appreciate the Cold War that was going on, but it really came to head in the 80s. And it came. I remember being in school, and we were still doing drills. We were still talking about what would happen if the U.S. and USSR went to war. There were movies at the time. War Games was a very influential movie back in the day. Firefox is one of my favorite Cold War films, Clint Eastwood. So you had a lot of that was like a real thing for us in terms of would we the whole thing was like would the U.S. and Russia go to war at some point. So you had that aspect to it as well. But then the last thing that I think really adds to the decade is the creation of and the proliferation of the personal computer. Technology, synthesizers, the MTV generation that bursted into the 80s. So the music changed. To me, 80s is still the most distinctive era of music. The 90s was kind of like the grunge kind of area, rap and hip hop kind of, sort of took off, gangster rap and whatnot took off. But in terms of like a distinct sound, like every generation for a long time had a sound. The 50s had a sound. The 60s had a sound. The 70s had a sound. The 80s had a sound. And there was some in the 90s, but now it's like since the 90s, everything's kind of sampled back. So it's like everyone's using samples from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or whatever. So, but that explosion with MTV, with Michael Jackson, Madonna, and whatnot. And again, it was reflected in the music, the bands, the rock bands, where we were seeing, a lot of that look, the dress, the hair, the costumes, the whatever. So it was just this sort of, everybody was really shedding away the veneer of the great society or traditional values or whatever. And so, look, I'm just going to be me. I'm going to grow my hair long. Like you look at the movie like Footloose, buck the religious authority, the institutions or whatnot. I'm just going to be a free, independent thinker. And it was in the music. Bruce Springsteen, kind of had that that kind of swag as well. So yeah, I think all of those things fed its way into the movies, and the movies had us thinking about serious topics like the Cold War, or even post-apocalypse stuff, like the Terminator, right? And everybody was coming out with a movie about, well, what happened, the president, what happens, what is our future, and they had all those dystopian future type of movies. Even if I go back a little bit to 79 with Mad Max, and then the Road Warrior that came after that. So everything was like kind of like, you had like this dark kind of future for us, because that's how scary things got at some point. Definitely from the late 70s through like 83, 84, 85. It was like every day you were talking about something with the U.S. and Soviet Union at some time. So I think it was a very much such a change, but really the takeoff when people started getting personal computers in every home. By the time I got to college in '87, I got my first Apple Macintosh computer, and I was like the cool kid on the block. But then everybody started getting them, so it was like it became, I think, in the late '80s, a personal computer became a necessity. Unless you went to the computer lab at the school, where you had to wait sometimes a couple hours to get a computer, especially during finals or midterm time, or you just made the investment and you bought your own. But then that opened you up to gaming and personal, computer games and all those, other things as well. So I think all of that showed up in the movie. So it was a rebellious time. It was optimistic in terms of people were using technology, for to paint a picture of the future. But there were some scary times too, just given the times we were in.
It's interesting you mentioned the rebellious times. So you look at something like the 70s, right? And you look at some of the films that came out during that period of time, and you had a lot of really kind of the independent films, independent filmmakers that started making films for some of the bigger companies, right? So you take a look at something like American Graffiti, right?
Mm-hmm.
So American Graffiti, like Universal had no idea what they had with American Graffiti. In fact, when they were done with the movie, they looked at the movie and they're like, we don't even know what we have. They thought, well, with the soundtrack, maybe we've got a chance of making some money back, so we're just going to put it out there. And it's this big hit. So Lucas turns around and the first studio he pitches Star Wars to is Universal. And Universal's like, we don't understand it, we don't get it, and so they step away. So it's interesting because I think that you had the 50s, which was very very compartmentalized as far as the very the morality was in check. Then you had the 60s where you had the rebelliousness. You had the 70s, which was all about independent filmmakers, chasing their vision. Then you had the 80s. And the one thing about the 80s is that you still had that independent filmmaker. You still had studios that were willing to take chances based upon their individual guts that, I don't understand what you're making, but I trust you to make it. Before we got into the 90s and the 2000s, where all of a sudden the corporate culture took over filmmaking, and you lost a lot of that, grand vision that you had. But the 80s was the spillover. It was, you still had that independent vision, but now all of a sudden you had the money and you had the technology behind it to create things like E.T., Back to the Future, Aliens,
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing that the 80s brought was the rise of the franchise, right?
Bingo.
You think about, right? You had in the 70s, you had Jaws, right? In the 80s, you had Jaws 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Jaws Revenge. I'm sorry. Sorry to mention that.
You count 3D too or no?
You had, in the 70s, you had Star Wars. 1980, you got Empire Strikes Back. You could argue that was made in the 70s still. You could technically argue it's a 70s film, but you still had,
Actually,
Empire Strikes Back and
I'm
Return of the
pushing you
Jedi.
Yeah.
You had Back to the Future was the beginning. You have Aliens, which is the sequel to Alien. I mean, it was the rise of the franchise.
Right. Although I would say, the outstanding standout from the 70s will probably be The Godfather 1 and 2.
Oh, certainly.
I would say,
certainly, right. The great.
But that model really wasn't
70s.
duplicated. Yeah, that wasn't, and again, the way it was shot, it was almost as if it was almost like they could have filmed both films back simultaneously, like they've done in the past. And
ironically,
what they tried to do with Superman 1 and 2. 1 and 2 is actually filmed mostly at the same time before they fired the director Richard Donner, and they had to get in Scott Lester to finish the film. So yeah, but it had that kind of epic scale to it, where there was like a continuity to the to that part 1 and 2, and then 3 took so long to get off the ground that that's why it's not his favorite. I still enjoyed 3, but
do you enjoy 3 with Richard Pryor in there?
Was that?
You enjoy 3 with Richard Pryor?
No, not Superman. Godfather. I'm saying.
Oh, Godfather 3.
Right.
I'm with you on that.
Godfather had a vibe as if 1 and 2 were almost shot together. It was like there was like such a continuity to it. It wouldn't surprise me if certain aspects were filmed between 1 and 2, because I know there were some flashback scenes also that they had.
Yeah, they were not filmed back to back.
Yeah.
There's a great documentary out there on Paramount Plus. It's called The Offer, and it's the story of the making of The Godfather. It's really interesting. If anybody's out there and they want to watch it, it's a really great little watch in regards to the producer. The guy who produced Godfather was also the creator of Hogan's Heroes. It's a great watch if you want to go down a little rabbit hole.
Hold on one second, guys, really fast. So if you type in Google best 80 movies, so this is the list you get: Goonies, E.T., Full Metal Jacket, Top Gun, both Star Wars. Star Wars. This one I was going to push back on you, Taylor. Is 1980 was released Empire Strikes Back. Then you have 83 Return of the Jedi, Circuits, Back to the Future.
Oh, come on. Short Circuit is not one of the greatest. Like, it's a popular film, but Short Circuit, there's no way on God's green earth you say that Short Circuit's one of the greatest films.
I didn't say one of the greatest. I say best of 80s. I said get your shit right.
Come on.
I wouldn't even call it best either. But
I don't know what list you're.
Cult classic, maybe.
Yeah.
Hold on. I saw Short Circuit in the theaters. It was a fun, entertaining film. It did generate a sequel.
I actually loved it as a kid.
I mean, it's a fun film. But when you want to look at the top films, go to IMDb. Maybe and look at their list. Their list, their number one on the list is, by the way, Amadeus is actually is their list. And Amadeus, Gandhi. Honestly, then they go with Raiders of the Lost Ark.
I just remember the music video. That was it.
Let me
finish
this really fast.
I never had an interest to see the film.
Hold on, let me finish.
I will say Amadeus is a great film.
Hang on. So Back to the Future, War Games, Blade Runner, Terminator. Where's the other one? This one I'm not familiar with. Maybe you heard it, Kelly. It's Bag and Bull, Killing Feud,
Raging Bull. You mean?
Yes, thank you.
Bull, yeah.
Yeah,
Raging Bull.
Yeah,
I mean, it's Martin Scorsese. Great film.
So, Superman was another one. I thought Supergirl was later on. I don't know.
Superman 2.
Yeah,
Superman 2 I think was 81 because I think Superman was 79.
Karate Kid,
78.
Rocky.
You're right, 78.
Karate Kid, Rocky, Scarface is another one. We talked about the.
And think about this. Think about how many of those films you just mentioned, Pete, that you know a quote from. Scarface, say hello to my little friend. Right? Yeah. I mean, there's so many quotable lines through those movies that you just don't get anymore. You tell me a movie in the last 10 years that you quote today. I can't think of a freaking... Now, I can think of some TV series and some things that I've seen that maybe might be quotable. But movies, you don't get any movies that are quotable anymore.
There's only one or two,
and that's
I would
because
say,
movies was... Well, give me one. Give me one you quote. Nothing, right?
Stumped them.
You didn't hear that? Seriously?
What?
This is Sparta.
What'd you say? Oh, This Is Sparta.
Yeah.
What is that?
300.
90. Yeah, but when was that made? 98?
No, that was 2000s, bro. What are you talking about?
All right. I'll give you 2003, maybe?
06, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I will not debate the Ghost of Sparta on when that particular film was made.
That one you can't. When it comes to Greek movies, you can't argue with me with that one.
Yeah, look, I'm not arguing with you on that. All right. But still, I mean, you said that the movie that you went to is 20 years old. 20 years.
I wasn't arguing that part.
But yet there's one after the other. I could mention a couple of films off the top of my head where you're going to be like, oh, I can quote that. You can quote Breakfast Club. You can quote, Breakfast Club. You can quote Stand By Me. Oh my God. Did we ever have friends like we did when we were kids? You can quote, Star Wars. You can quote Raiders of the Lost Ark. You can quote Back to the Future. There was an economy of movie making in that time that does not exist anymore.
Right.
It was about storytelling. It was about creating the most compact, how do you cut it down to the best story you can in X period of time. Right. Now they're all about expanding it. Like everything's a TV series.
Right. But let me ask you something though. Can we attribute though the 80s ultimately to two people? Well, yeah, I would say two people. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Because again, they were relatively unknown. Jaws came out in 75. American Graffiti came out, 73?
Was it 73 or was it 74? Yeah.
It was early 70s.
Yeah.
But those guys 75. Had films that were like, Jaws at the time, it was like a phenomenon. It was just like people, they used to show like they would sell the movie by having commercials where people literally screaming in the theater. Like to show,
I would go.
Yeah.
I would certainly give you Steven Spielberg. He gave us Raiders. I mean, George Lucas gave you the story, but
I'm just saying. But the fact that studios
Raiders,
took time on these independent film, these filmmakers, like these guys.
Spielberg produced Back to the Future. Spielberg produced Poltergeist.
Yeah,
that was the other thing. If you look at all the genres, I mean, what else did you have? You had one of the greatest horror films of all time, The Shining. It came out in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you over and over again, you've got a movie that nobody understood at the time. It was a flop in the box office, but now is looked at as a seminal sci-fi film of all time, and that's Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's Ridley Scott in the 80s. You have Die Hard. I mean, Die Hard, considered one of the greatest action films of all time. You have The Road Warrior. Probably, arguably the greatest action film of all time, right? George Miller. Road Warrior, yeah. I mean, come on.
He's up there on the list, seriously.
I don't know if I put it over Die Hard, but that's just me.
That's also a preference, too.
Personally, I'm a Die Hard fan.
Right.
But from a pure action spectacle standpoint, what Miller achieved in Road Warriors is considered one of the greatest action films of all time.
Mm-hmm.
You'd probably, for the 80s, you'd probably Die Hard, Road Warrior. You could, exchange them either way, one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have films like The Untouchables. You have, Brian De Palma giving you The Untouchables, and even the rise of Kevin Costner. He was a no name. He was cut out of the Big Chill, but Big Chill. He was in Silverado in probably one of his most electric roles that he played in his young career. And then he stars in The Untouchables, one of the best, crime dramas that you're going to get out of the 80s. Mm-hmm. I mean, so many great films. Terminator, you already mentioned Terminator earlier. The Thing, one of the greatest sci-fi horror films of all time, John Carpenter.
Right. But then there's also when you talk about the horror films, again, that horror genre, like the gore, the Howling, at least the first one anyway. But you had the Howling, you had American Werewolf in London,
American Wolverine.
That special effects really started to take off, where the transformation scenes became iconic,
Yeah.
and whatnot. And then you had, again, most of the Jason and Halloween movies. I know Halloween came out like in '79, but then you had sort of like the slasher, all the
Once
blood
again,
and guts came out in the
it's the
70s.
franchise, right? The franchises bloomed in the 80s.
Yeah,
That's why I think we're starting a little franchise. Okay, let me ask you a question really fast. What do you think is sets between the movies between the difference from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and like that 80 Pacific? I wanted to focus on for a minute. Difference of quality and impact, versus anything else.
Well, I think it was the impact of studio, right? So in the 70s, I really do believe that you had the emergence of freedom of the auteur. It became all about the auteur, all about the director and his vision, and that's the reason why you've got some great films in the 70s. But what did they not have? They did not have the budgets, nor did they have the special effects. The 90s, then, you had this glorious run of the 80s where you had these great films, and then all of a sudden you had the 90s. Because what did the 80s give birth to? The 80s gave birth to the blockbuster, which then gave birth to the studio system trying to replicate that last big hit. And so because you had this great film, they're trying to figure out, well, what did you do in this film to make this film, right? You take a look at a movie like Batman, right? Batman came out in '89, and it was the last kind of vestige, but it was the beginning of the studio system, because the guy, John Peters, who produced the film, if you if you go back and you watch some of his interviews as to why Batman was so successful, he's so off the mark as to the reason for the film being successful. He doesn't mention Tim Burton. He doesn't mention the performances. He doesn't mention the iconic character or any of the things that really, truly transcended and allowed Batman to become such a great film, or a seminal film for the end of the 80s. He talked about the fact that, why? It's because we had real ninjas fighting against Batman. That's in his mind, his studio mind. Was the reason why Batman was so successful. We had real ninjas, real people who knew martial arts fighting against Batman. And that was the beginning of the studio starting to take over, and the auteur was no longer looked at, or the writer of the film was no longer looked at as the predominant creative force. It became the studio heads becoming the creative force. There's a great podcast out there by Robert Altman. Robert Altman used to write for Cinescape magazine. I used to read that, back in the day.
I did too. And
he directed. He was a co-writer and directed the film Free Enterprise. It's a great little film, an homage to Star Trek fans and William Shatner. They got William Shatner to be in it. But he talks today about how far Hollywood has fallen, and that today Hollywood is predominantly filled with people who have no idea how to make a movie. There's more people involved in the filmmaking process than ever before that have no idea they think they know how to make a movie, but they have no idea how to make a movie. In the 80s, you still had the auteur, and then you started having the money of the studio, but the studio had not yet taken over. And I think that's why we have such great films.
Also, Kelly, I feel like during the 80s, they had fresh ideas. Now, I think they're just running out of ideas at this point. Like, they don't know what else to do.
I mean, there's a lot of truth in the fact that, you get a lot of retreads, right? And we've now lived long enough that we're starting to see, like when I saw the remake of Total Recall coming out, it's just like, really? How long oh my God, it's been 30 years since Total Recall came out, I guess. And that's usually seems to be what it is. 25 to 30 years ago, if they did a property, it's ripe for being remade. But you're right. And if you think about it, why would it be that now you're seeing more remakes than ever before? It's because, once again, the auteur and the writer are not the predominant mover in Hollywood. It's now studios. And they're like, well, what was successful 25, 30 years ago? Oh, let's remake that. That's the reason why you're starting to see that. because it's no longer about the writer. It's no longer about the director.
But Kelly, don't you feel like that's a way of being a little lazy too?
Without a doubt, it's the quick wick. It's the quick way to get to the dollar amount, right? That's what it's about. So like how it's such a bit. I mean, it was always a business, but now it's run like a business. You know, when the Wachowski brothers were when they approached so many studios in regards to The Matrix, nobody understood it. Nobody got it. Finally, somebody at Warner Bros. Everybody at Warner Bros. Didn't get it either, but finally somebody at Warner Bros. Was like, I don't understand what you're trying to make, but I like you. And so I'm going to take a chance on you. And that's how the Wachowski brothers were able to create The Matrix. It was the same thing with George Lucas. George Lucas shopped that not only at Universal, he shopped it at every studio. Star Wars.
I remember that.
Nobody wanted Star Wars. Nobody understood it.
Star Wars basically got made by one guy.
One guy.
Alan Ladd Jr.
Right.
Alan Ladd,
one
if
guy.
it wasn't for Alan Ladd, Star Wars wouldn't have got made.
One guy at 20th Century Fox said, you know what? And you know why he made it? It's because he didn't understand Star Wars.
Right.
But he said to Lucas, he said, you know what? I loved American Graffiti. I don't understand what you want to make, but I trust you. And that kind of gut filmmaking doesn't seem to exist anymore. I mean, you get it a little bit in TV. Why is it that streaming and everything is taken off? And why is it that you see so much more compelling storytelling in that format now? It's because I think, they're trying to compete with movies by saying, hey, listen, we got a better story. And in a lot of cases, they're right.
That's interesting you say that, Kelly, because I always thought, like, at least back in the 80s, movies were always better than the shows because they have a higher budget.
Right.
Yeah,
George
Lucas
and
is a good
back
example.
In the 80s, the movie was the pinnacle, right?
Yeah.
You did movies, you were the top
Top
of your craft, yes. But now movies are no longer the top. You get yourself, look at how many movie stars are now doing TV series. It's not because they can't do a movie. It's because they can't find compelling stories to do in movies anymore.
I'll give you that one. Paul, what do you think? Same question.
To what specifically?
Let me get my question here up again. In your personal opinion, what do you think about movies back in the 80s that keeps them separate apart between franchises, quality, and impact?
Well, as far as on the quality and impact, I just think we're just subject to the times. The fact that the 80s was like the birth and the explosion of technology, of video games, of music, of technology in general, it's like you can't replicate that. Like your first time you saw, I remember having like the pocket football game, the Mattel football game. We thought that was the greatest. Ever since you had Game Boy and all these devices, your phone has these great graphic games or whatever. Even then, it's almost like it's hard to be impressed. Because back then it was like you're seeing something. The first time I saw Star Wars, I was just blown away. You just couldn't imagine the feeling and the explosion and the time, the action figures, the trading cards, so it's hard to get that back. It's like, I don't try not to be cruel. It's like the first time you've done it, it's hard to replace that feeling again.
I don't know what you mean, Paul. I don't know.
You got sons. You do know what I mean, but I'm just saying. But it's like you just can't put that genie back in the bottle. So I think we're spoiled to an extent because everything now is like you have to impress us. Back then it was like we were impressed for decades, but now it's to the point where we were talking about this a few shows ago. It's almost now they almost rely too much on CGI now.
I was about to say that.
In terms of telling real stories. But when you combine the storytelling the times, the scale. Because again, no one was giving until after Star Wars, until after 77. No one was giving that kind of budget. Superman came out the next year in 78. But to give those kind of budgets to those mega films, nobody was doing. Star Wars was made for $10 million.
That's it.
You know what I mean? And George had to do a lot to try to raise his own money, or he bet on himself. It's like, don't even pay me salary, just give me the merchandising. And you don't even have to pay me basically for the film. Just give me the distribution right or whatever. I think 20th Century Fox did the distribution. But you know, he bet on himself in order for that to be successful. So, you know, I think that again, it's just the uniqueness of the time. The Cold War, as I said earlier, that was a scary, exciting time to be in. The rebellious time, the music, the dress, the clothing, the birth of rap. Really, I mean, rap started basically in like 70. I think it got like 76, 77. Like, you know, when those guys out of Brooklyn, Queens kind of got started with it. And even then it was more like the disco version, but rap exploded. Run DMC in the 80s and Rap Attack and all that stuff. Breakdancing, the hip hop culture had its birth, the graffiti, all of that, all of those things were birthed in that period. So you were just on sensory overload. So I think part of the nostalgia of the movies is nostalgia of the era. Because I don't think we've ever seen an era. I don't think we'll ever see an era like that again. It is very difficult in 2024 to impress us with almost anything, you know.
So I want to touch
back
base on that.
then, we were impressed. We were wowed. It was just coming in from like, oh my gosh, where are we going with all this stuff? Now it's kind of like, you know, it's almost like cynicism now in terms of it takes a lot to impress people these days.
So I kind of want to touch base on that a little bit, Paul, what you just said. It's hard to impress us. So let me ask you guys both a question. Do you guys consider a reboot and rewrite the same thing?
Reboot and a rewrite?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No.
Good.
Reboot is literally you going back to the original formula. Rewrite is like you're swapping characters out. I think we talked about some of the show. You make the hero of the movie now becomes a heroine. Like a reimagining, so to speak.
I want to use Batman for example, because he's the one that we have seen 3 reboots on him. Pretty much, we had the 1989 was it, Kelly? Am I right or wrong?
89. Yep,
89.
that was Tim
then
Burton.
You have 2000 with Batman Begin, with my personal opinion, one of the best Batmans. Then you have this new kid who's doing another Batman. They're all different versions, but they'll have the same baseline. So what was such the difference between all 3? So one did really well, one did okay, one did extremely well. So what's the difference? Acting, CGI, writing? What?
No. Listen, when it comes to Batman, it's interesting you should mention Batman because the Bruce Wayne Batman character is my favorite character in all medium.
Okay.
I mean, there's no character I like better than Bruce Wayne and Batman. And, you know, first and foremost, before you talk about what doesn't work, you have to think about what does work, right? And if you stick to the character as he was written in the comics, there's a reason why he lasted since the 40s, and it's because he's got a universality to him of this, hey, this terrible thing happened to me. I'm going to transform myself into a force to fight against that which I feel has wronged me, right? Now, you add the money in there, and that's necessary as a necessary to explain why he's able to do what he does, why he has the time to do, why he has the resources he does, right? But when you look at Batman, the reason why the 89 Batman was so incredibly successful at the time is because up to that point, the most successful live-action Batman was the 1960s TV series, which was campy as all hell.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that they tried to take Batman serious at all. And people were starving for, you know, a realistic approach or a more realistic approach. Because if you go back and you watch the Batman films. I mean, they're still campy. They have such a level of I don't know, stylized essence.
It was definitely dark noir.
But it felt darker. It felt more realistic than we'd ever seen before.
Right.
And then, even within that, you had Batman and Batman Returns, both Tim Burton. And then you moved on to the Joel Schumacher Batman Forever and the Batman and Robin, which was just a debacle.
Yeah.
That got you back to the 1960s campy Batman. That's basically what you got back to. And when you got back to that, the studios realized, wow, they didn't want, the audiences don't want this. So when you reboot it again, and you reboot it with an auteur like Christopher Nolan, who takes this and says, I'm going to do this as realistic as possible. And all he manages to do is create arguably the greatest superhero, definitely one of the greatest noir films of all time with The Dark Knight. But once again, you've got the character right. And I've got a lot of problems with The Dark Knight Rises and Nolan's choices there. But aside from that, The Dark Knight can't get the core characters of Batman more right than they do there. Then you flash forward to the new version of Batman, once again, taking it as serious as you possibly can. And that's the key, right? Hire great actors. You've got, Jeffrey Wright and some great actors playing some great roles. Keep the characters honest to the source material, and you've got great film. And that's, I think all three of them have their greatness. I'm partial mostly to the Nolan, but I think that what they've done with the latest Batman is pretty awesome.
Paul, you're up.
Is there any just side note? Is there any timetable for it? Are they going to do another one? That came out almost 3 years.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah.
There's two things going on with the Batman right now. The sequel is they're working on the sequel, but there's also very shortly on Max, you're going to get a TV series that it's all about Colin Farrell's The Penguin, and it's about it's a short series that tells you how the Penguin rose to prominence in Gotham.
So Kelly, before I move to Paul, I want to ask you a question because you need to touch base on this one. I'm just curious why. Ben Affleck, I know he's in Justice League. He doesn't really count in the series, but why don't you touch base on him? I'm curious.
Well, the most recent iteration, I thought Affleck was good as Batman, as an older Batman. I think he brought a seriousness and a physicality to Batman that you haven't seen. I liked a lot about it. They made the decision to let Batman kill, which is completely against the character and everything that we know about the character. And that's even in that regard, it was fine.
Although he did kill in Batman '89, technically. So
you might throw a joke over.
He did. He came in with the remote Batmobile. He drops the bomb in front of those guys and blows it up.
Well, we don't know that they died. we don't know that they died. But
Joker gets
I agree with
chucked off the freaking top of the church. So he killed Joker.
Well, but in that moment, keep in mind that the Joker basically let himself go. That was
he tried to rescue him. True.
Yeah, basically
dropping a little bomblet in front of all those guys in front of the Batmobile. Yeah, it's the chances of survivability.
I think that was the stun bomb.
Seriously,
but the factory blew up. The factory blew up.
That was the stun bomb that was happening there.
So how did the factory blow up then?
Well, that was more the Joker than him. He was just firing his way out to get out.
Let me guess. Somebody was smoking a cigarette, threw it at the gasoline, blew the whole goddamn place up.
Yeah, it was really not bad, man.
You smoked everywhere back then.
These Batman advocates, man, I tell you, man, they should be press secretary, U.S. press secretary.
Probably.
Paul, you go next. I got my opinion on this because I don't think me and Kelly are going to be arguing in a second here.
All right, so again, why the different Batmans over time, or I mean, I just want to make sure I get your question right. Where you going with it?
My question is why is Batman is more a reboot a series versus a rewrite. So I personally think one series better than the other, like Kelly does. And I want your opinion about that. Why is that so successful over the years versus anything else has not been successful as much? Like Superman, they tried rebooting that. I think once by now, and it already failed. No, twice. I'm sorry, twice.
Look, I thought Man of Steel itself was pretty good. I mean, I think they kind of went up the rails of the Justice League. I thought, and I like, and honestly, I like Superman Returns. I know they kind of gave you like the emo Superman, like he was, too much, and he was kind of creepy with the, staring in Lois's house and everything, kind of make him stalkerish a little bit. But I liked. I listen. I liked the overall. It definitely reminded me of the Superman of the 70s. I thought it was great casting for him, and I thought this, it didn't have as much action as I liked, but I thought, okay, if they would have made a sequel and made more action in it, okay, so yeah, you got the reintroduction and everything, and so I liked it. I mean, I thought Brandon Routh, I thought he did a decent job in that, but that being said, why the Batman? I think it's just the vision of the vision of those who were there. I mean, because really, '89 Batman is really '40s Batman to large extent. They took a lot of material from the Killing Joke. I thought so. It was almost like a retro style sort of setting with Gotham City. It was like this dark, dingy place. So it reminded you of the '40s and '50s comic book. I think Jack Nicholson, stole the movie. His over the top as the Joker. So I wasn't expecting that. So I thought that definitely took over there. Then you fast forward. Now I wasn't a fan though of the sequel film. What was
Batman Returns, I think is it.
Batman Returns, yeah, wasn't crazy about that.
I agree with you. That wasn't the one.
It definitely was a bit of a letdown, I would say, after the anticipation.
Batman and Robin.
Well, yeah, I mean everything's past that in that run. Yeah, I mean obviously it to me it was like diminishing returns with each film. It seemed like the Nolan series again put Batman more in reality. I thought like I said, the original Batman '89. I thought it was definitely an homage to the '40s and '50s, that kind of classic noir. I thought the Nolan series put Batman in modern reality, and again gave you a bit more of his backstory and his journey. The fact that he was a ninja. I mean, none of that was really. My only issue with the '89 Batman was, I couldn't buy Michael Keaton outside of as Bruce Wayne. I just, in the suit, yeah, he shined.
This is where I'm going to get to right now, and this is where me and Kelly are going to argue now. So, friend of the show, Pop Culture Warrior, CQ, he thinks, and I kind of agree with him a little bit too, is one Batman is more a Bruce Wayne, and that is Keith. Then you have the other one, Chris Bale. He's more a Batman. And the newer Batman, in his opinion, is more a Batman and Bruce Wayne. I personally disagree. I think Chris Bale is more a Batman and a Bruce Wayne, personally.
Listen, Pete, you and I are not going to disagree on this. I think Christian Bale is the greatest Batman / Bruce Wayne that we've ever had. I think, but I don't know that it's Christian Bale so much as it's the writing, because the writing dictates that Bruce Wayne is playing as a playboy, but he's the smartest guy in the room. And he is tired, because you know what? Half the time he's staying up all night, kicking ass in a cosplay outfit. Yeah. And then, next thing you know, he's still got to get up and go to meetings in the morning. He shows up with 2 girls on his arm because he wants to portray himself as an idiot and just, he's all about the bimbos. Like, they do a great job in that series of portraying Bruce Wayne exactly how you have to portray Bruce Wayne. In fact, I don't think in the first 2 films, you can't get Bruce Wayne and Batman better. It's in the third film Batman Rises, where the wheels come off the truck.
Oh,
and that's
that disaster.
Well, that's because they decide.
Disaster. I mean, again, there was some. Just I have my issues with it. I mean, the Bane character, I thought just no one would that was totally right.
Forget about Bane. Forget about Bane.
Okay.
That's not the issue with the film. The issue is you're going to take a character who, as long as we've ever known him, he has been obsessed with fighting crime. In fact, his parents were killed in front of him, so he devoted his life to learning how to fight. How does he scare people, and how does he fight crime? But the moment his girlfriend gets killed, supposedly, he then goes off
into a
and hides for 8 years. Now, in that sequence where Commissioner Gordon's given the speech, if his speech had just been like, hey, listen, we've been trying to catch the Batman for 8 years. We haven't been able to catch him. He's been missing for the last year and a half. He's done, yes, we know he's done some good. Then that gives you the opportunity to say, okay, all the things we know about his rogues gallery happened during that X period of time. Now he's beat up and he's broken, and it's the last year and a half he's been missing. But like, they have that scene with that little kid who's 8 years old, and they're like, do you believe he exists? Yes, I believe he exists. Bullshit. You weren't even fucking alive the last time he was walking the damn streets. Like, you have no idea whether or not he exists or not.
We're getting the eye up tonight.
It's so dumb. It's just so dumb. But like, if the kid had been if Batman had been out there, and the real people know he exists, and obviously Commissioner Gordon knows he's out there doing good, and he has to play it the way he does, that's fine. But this whole thing that so he went up against Ra's al Ghul, he went up against the Joker, and then that's his entire career until he fights Bane. I mean, come on. It's the dumbest thing.
Honestly, I felt like he had a cock in his mouth the whole time when he was talking.
What's that?
I felt like he had a cock in his mouth the whole time when he had talking.
Oh, shit.
Let me straight up with you.
Well,
Listen, here's my issue with Rising. Here's my issue with Rising.
Where are you going?
Here's my issue with Rising. You coming off one of the best... I don't care what any of you guys are going to say this. The best Batman movie ever made, Dark Knight. You coming off that. You could not beat it. If you even try to, let's say you have the best writer in the world, writing it, the best director, the best everything. You could not beat that. I'm sorry.
I would have been fine with The Dark Knight Rises if they had not tried to say he's been hiding for 8 years. All you got to do, and in my head, I've fantasized about just giving a Dark Knight Rises edit where we use CGI to change what Gordon's saying in that speech to, something along the lines of, yeah, we've been trying to catch him for 8 years. We haven't been able to. He's been missing for the last year and a half. Then the film's fine. I mean, it's not the greatest, but it's not bad. I mean, it's not a bad film, and I understand.
So how would you, so,
but you coming up
okay, so Dark Knight Rises or Godfather Part 3?
Dark Knight Rises or Godfather Part 3 as far as better film?
Yeah, I mean, or in terms of letdown, because clearly for most people, for a lot of people, Dark Knight Rises.
Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah, I would say Dark Knight Rises.
Okay.
Dark Knight
Rises.
Rises.
One last question, and we get back on topic. So there have been rumors. They say this is never going to happen. I personally disagree. I think they're keeping it hush hush. And with the Flash, I think there's a little sneak peek of it coming too. At Batman Beyond, you don't think it's going to happen?
Oh, well, yes. There's some things going on there. Unfortunately, for my taste, James Gunn likes the extreme of characters, right? So, like, the Batman movie that we're going to get is called Batman Brave and the Bold, and I can't stand the idea. As much as I trust Gunn, as much as I trust Gunn, I can't stand the idea because in this film, it's going to be Batman, and the Robin in that film is going to be Damian, which is Batman's son. So all of a sudden, we're going to have a Batman film where we're going to skip Grayson, we're going to skip Jason Todd, we're going to skip to Damian, we're going to skip Tim Drake,
Yeah,
There's been
there
four.
were four Robins, right?
Yeah,
Well, there's been 5 if you count the Dark Knight Returns, but really 4 major in the canon of comics. We're gonna skip them all and get to Damian, which means if we're gonna get to Damian, Batman's got to be older. Why are we starting the DCU with an older Batman? Just once again, it feels like we're just rushing. We're rushing to the best story instead of being like Iron Man. Like that'd be like starting with Iron Man and saying the second movie of Iron Man is an Avengers film. It's the same dumb stuff that they did with the DCEU, where we got Batman, or we got, Man of Steel, and then all of a sudden we've got Dawn of Justice, and then next thing you know, they're fighting each other. Like, it's just so dumb. And I can't stand the fact that James Gunn has decided that that's where we're gonna go. We're gonna go. Why not give us a movie with these other Robins and then eventually get us to Damian? If you have faith in your storytelling, if you have faith in the context of the story, then tell the story. Because we've never had a good Batman and Robin story on film. We've never had a Batman Jason Todd. We haven't had a Batman Tim Drake. And now all of a sudden we're going to get this Batman Damian story. Like, you're going to all of a sudden, Nightwing exists, but we don't know exactly why Nightwing exists. It's dumb.
We need the backstory. Like, at least if they did with Batman Beyond, you don't need the backstory as much because it's years later in the show. In the future. So,
I hate it. I hate Batman Beyond. I hate the cartoon. Yeah. Can't stand the idea of it.
Yeah.
I know it's pretty.
You've run out of story ideas if you have to say, "Oh, well, now Bruce Wayne is no longer Batman." Shut up. Bruce Wayne should always be Batman. Just like James Bond is always the guy. James Bond is always 007.
Dude,
just give us another guy.
Heat we got on that video. I cut that shit up, and people were arguing "Man, they should never." They're literally getting into it in my comment section. I'm like, shit, people got into it, Brad. So, okay, let me ask you a quick question really fast. Let's get back on topic really fast. How did the culture and social, I guess, dynamic back then in the 80s influence the theme of the movie, the versus now? Like an era almost.
How did the culture and social economics influence the 80s?
Yeah, it was a movie part of it, of course, I'm talking about.
Well, listen, you're coming out of the 70s, you go into the 80s, right? You think about what was going on in the 80s, and in the beginning of the 80s, you had a lot of angst, a lot of. Whenever you have scary times in the world, fantastical is successful in film, right? So you had a time period where you had Reagan. Gorbachev bring down this wall. You had the idea of Star Wars and how do we fight against nuclear war, and you had a lot of social and cultural angst going on, and that's the reason why you had so much success in these fantastical films. People wanted to escape. They wanted to believe in heroes. They wanted to be able to believe that Indiana Jones could conquer the Nazis and that, you could fight against, an alien intrusion. One woman could beat the aliens, that you could go back in time and fix the things that went wrong in your parents' life. That although that there's the end of the world with the Terminator, that there was still a hope for mankind in the past. And so I think that had a lot to do with it. And that was part of the rise of the comedies as well. Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like I said, John Hughes was huge in the 80s because he really connected to what people believed was the truth of being young, the truth of that time period. So you look at, The Breakfast Club. To this day, it's still looked at as a great film because there were truths there of childhood. And I don't necessarily believe that the greatest action film, the greatest drama, the greatest war films of all time were made in the 80s. I do believe the 80s had the greatest comedies of all time. But when you look at the overall arching 80s, I do believe heavily that the 80s was the greatest period for. I think there's an argument to say that they were the greatest period of time for film.
Mm-hmm. Paul, what do you think?
Well, I think I touched on that on the onset. Again, the times with the Cold War at its height at that particular time. Again, the proliferation of technology, the radical change in music, hearing the synthesizer in the music and the digital drum players and just all of the new sounds. It's like I said, your senses were just stimulated on every level in the 80s in a way that was not there before. And so I think it definitely reflected in the films. And I think for the first time, we really started dealing with some of the angst in society. Like I said, the Breakfast Club, again, I think it still holds weight. I can show that to my daughters today, and it would still be relevant to them, dealing with social acceptance and whatnot. I don't think, films really looked at it from the student's perspective. But again, there was a lot of this sort of anti-authority type of, figures you started to see more than proliferate in the 80s. But I think still the good thing was you did see a lot more heroes, a lot of anti-heroes. You could argue that the birth of the anti-hero may have came in the 80s. The one who sort of rebelled against authority but was still the good guy and you still rooted for them. I certainly think you saw a lot more of that. I mean, 70s you had like Dirty Harry and you had, to an extent, James Bond to an extent. But I thought you really started to see the birth of that kind of character, hero and heroine. Like I said, again, strong female heroine with Ripley and the Aliens franchise. So you started to see that. I think was certainly a positive, part of the era was the birth of these people, the Indiana Jones and people who, like I said, you really rooted for. But I think the palette was opened up where I don't think you could go in so many different directions. So you had the birth of like I said, the sci-fi film, you had the 80s Cold War films, you had the horror films, you had the rebellious kid films of the time. There was just so many. It was like going into a blockbuster, literally. And you got all these different sections that you could at any given time just go in that you might not have seen before. So I think just the explosion, it was almost like the Big Bang, so to speak, of films and the types of films and things you could choose from. Where it's back in the 50s, basically you had your dramas, your action dramas, your cop dramas, and you had your alien invasion films in the 50s. In the 60s, again, kind of similar form, the westerns, cop films or whatever, and again, more aliens from outer space trying to get you. 70s was more or less like dealing with a lot of the cultural changes of the day, a lot of the grift that started to maybe happen in society until Star Wars came, which gave you again a much more bigger, broader look at the future. But I think the 80s it really gave you such a diverse accent. It can't be replaced. Like it won't in every film or anything that's going to come since. I think the 80s and possibly a little bit of the 90s, a little bit, but I think everything cycles back. Like I think it's almost to the point I can't see in the creative people creating anything that wasn't created in the 80s. The 80s was like the last explosion of biodiversity, so to speak.
There's so many
everyone's been trying to do that.
There's so many great films from the 80s, and there's so many. We've mentioned it a lot tonight, but there's a lot of films that were great that you kind of forget came out in the 80s, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, right? Moonstruck, right. And think about how many of these films you can quote a line from. Moonstruck, snap out of it, right? Steel Magnolias,
Mm-hmm.
Empire, like we talked about Empire before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's so many movies. Stand and Deliver. You know, great drama. I mean, the Do the Right Thing, right? Came out during that same period of time.
Yeah.
Purple Rain, which was kind of like arguably not the greatest film of all time, but one of the greatest soundtracks of all time.
Yeah.
National Lampoon's Vacation came out during this period of time. And are they still making these movies today?
Right.
Yes. You know?
And also when you speak of soundtracks, even the idea of soundtracks, was it that even big until the 80s?
Yeah,
like
I mean,
70s, I remember in the 70s, like you had like Star Wars came out like on a double album. Like I remember that back, you know, then. But I don't think you had, again, people going into music stores, because you had music stores back then. We actually bought records and DVDs and things of that nature, CDs, and buying like soundtracks to these films. Everything
really
else was like orchestrated, like John Barry or some, you know. But I mean, major artists, like we talked about the James Bond, you know, Duran Duran doing A View to a Kill or whatnot. I mean, like the music merged with the film.
I mean, and that was started with American Graffiti, because that was really the first. That was the thing they thought. They didn't think they had much of a movie. They thought, well, maybe the movie will sell some soundtracks.
Right,
you know,
right? Yeah.
But that was, you know, the 70s. Like that was the beginning of it, though.
But the explosion came in the 80s, though.
Oh, yeah. Desperately Seeking Susan. Flash Dance.
Yeah, but that's the thing.
Footloose.
And most of the music videos,
a
lot of them were scenes from the movie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They just spliced a lot of scenes from the movie together, and that was like the music video. And then they would intersperse with the performer singing the song or whatever, but they would always go back to flashbacks of the movie. Again, that's the merging of the music with the scene. So even when you're listening to the music, you're thinking about the scene. When you're watching Footloose or hearing Kenny Loggins doing Footloose or hearing Top Gun, your mind instantly flashes to the scene in the film. It's in your head. You're
guys,
watching the movie in your head.
Quick second before we move on. I want to welcome Black David on the panel. What's going on, brother?
How you doing, London?
What's up?
I'm enjoying the conversation. It became classic American Graffiti. I remember that was based on the location in Queens, New York.
You were in your 60s back then when that came out, right?
Nice.
No, that was our pain.
I ain't that old. That's our pain.
But I mean, even if you think during the 80s, think about you know, the proliferation of Japanese animation, right? Studio Ghibli was just starting to hit, like with My Neighbor Totoro. You know, I mean, like that was the beginning of their run of just some of the greatest animated films of all time, which, you know, during that time,
but
wasn't as well known. But
you know, the anime film was very, very old, because even though it was in the 80s, they were produced in the 70s.
Yes, that's what we're talking about earlier. Yep.
That was crazy about it, because when I did I'm an anime junkie. When I was looking at a lot of these anime they had out there, and I thought to realize, wait a minute, they had it more than a decade before they aired out in the US. I think you so behind. So those who did in the
anime.
They were the place in Chinatown in Manhattan, where you get all the anime that you never see on TV yet that was about to come. If you go over there, you get lost.
So
you'll be there for hours just picking up.
There is one movie, I haven't found a name of it, that was the #1 anime movie released in the United States.
Akira.
Thank you. There you go.
Yeah.
Come on. I told him anime junkie.
That was the first. Now again, I must admit I was a bit late to the party when it came to anime in its essence like that. And honestly, quite frankly, I wasn't really up on, like, remember Gotcha Man or Battle of the Planets from the 70s. For some reason, I didn't even Speed Racer. I didn't connect the dots. When I was a kid, I didn't connect the dots to that being Japanese animation. It was I didn't put two and two together at that point. But it wasn't until Akira came out, and then you had like Monster City and Bubblegum Crisis and stuff like that. A friend of mine, he was into all of that. He kind of put me on game on that. But Akira is like the first film that I saw that really kind of like opened up my eyes to that world in and of itself, not just looking at it from the American import, or some would say bastardization of the Japanese property or whatever. That
You
made
know,
it more
Voltron was
sophisticated.
actually Japanese product. It wasn't actually an American product. I thought Voltron was an American product
No,
when I
Yeah,
realized
yeah,
Japanese.
yeah.
Even
the
I think
original name for
Thundercats
Voltron
too.
was Gold Lion. I was like, what?
Yeah, Kelly, isn't the Thundercats Japanese too? Or am I wrong on that?
Which one?
Thundercats.
Thundercats.
No, it's American. I believe.
No, that's American. Yeah,
American. Okay. I thought-
Voltron is Japanese. The original name
Japanese. Voltron's
was
Japanese.
it was
Yep.
Gold Lion. And when I started to look at all the past anime, I started to compare with the Voltron. I said, hold on. That is anime. That is not cartoon.
Yeah,
Something is off by that. Then the voice over, then you start to tell about it, because like Dragon Ball Z, the original Dragon Ball Z actually have cursing,
Mhm.
actually have blood. They were
Yeah.
doing I was like, now some of us were so hardcore into anime that one in particular went a bit further. He actually went to Japan to study under the legendary manga artists, to the point whereby he ended up being one of the first and only black men to own a anime studio in Japan.
Nice.
That that was a very big deal, because you was out there and did an interview with him, and it was saying that these people take their anime to a level of perfection. Perfection is the key. No one allowed to bring a script or a manuscript or anything and think, we they gonna put it on the script. No, they're gonna put you through the ringer. If it's not worth it, they'll send you back home to continue work on your project. So the guy who passed away, Akira Toriyama, was a very big deal to a lot of artists out
He was
there.
a genius. He was a god to anime fans. I hate
Pure
saying that
god.
word, but seriously, like I know we are Christians here, most of us.
I know.
But to the anime community, he's Zeus.
And
yeah, but a lot,
everybody,
but a lot of that. I mean, for us again, everything was like dumbed down here. Like a lot of that anime wasn't written for children. It wasn't. They made it into children's. Like when they had like Battle of the Planets over here, they put Seven's Arc 7 in and all those things in because they were kind of capitalized like on the Star Wars R2D2 thing. So again, we didn't. It wasn't until years later that I actually saw like what the real Gotcha Man series.
I know, and you start to feel hurt,
here's
like
my
you start to feel like you got
pushback on that,
betrayed.
Here's my pushback
Yeah.
on that. So during Toonami, when most of this anime was released, I think it was like during 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon. I think it was. So at midnight, they did a second run Toonami, but they did it dark. The dark side, I think they called it, or something like that. So it was the original footage, blood, tits hanging out, cursing, the whole 9 yard after midnight. And like,
Yeah, I
I
remember.
never watched the original stuff aired at 4 o'clock. I always reset my VCR. Yes, I am that old. Don't make comments. My VCR to record, or my DVR to record the midnight one versus the 4 o'clock version of that.
Oh, it's a big difference.
Oh God, big difference, humongous difference, bro. What are you talking about?
There's a bunch of
versus like
there's a bunch of iconic anime that people would hope to do a remake of it. That one called Thunder Sub,
which one?
but it was not. There's the anime called Thunder Sub, but the voiceover was so similar to that of Voltron. Like when you hear the voiceover, it's like, wait a minute, something's off of this voiceover. If you're very key to detail, what I was, then when I started to realize what the original anime was, I was like, when they will bring this thing over again? Because there were so many iconic. We have Akira, we have Fist of the North Star, you have what was it? It was like a horror-like anime. I forgot what it was. It was very gruesome. There were a lot of them. I used to have a book, and I used to list the year of the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 70s, all the iconic anime that people like to look for and bring it back. And before you know it, they did have the manga. So Barnes& Noble made a killing off that. Because of that, because I see a lot of old folk in our age group and your age group, Mom to Bet, you'd be surprised. They were trying to catch up. Just like you missed it, they're now realizing the artwork, how the anime came about, because the manga came first. For example, Dragon Ball Z started around Was it 1981, 1982, I believe. Then the anime came in 1984
Which one? Dragon
before
Ball?
it came out in the U. Yeah, Dragon Ball.
Oh yeah, Dragon Ball's been around for a while, a very long time actually. I can look it up for you
Very,
right now actually.
and when I found out how old it, I was like, wait, this is kind of crazy. They say the oldest anime was out in the 60s, black and white. I was like, what?
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
one
didn't
of
you have like
the
Gigantor and
Gundam
The
was
old
one of the
one.
older ones too.
yeah, yeah.
So before we get off too far topic, I want to mention one thing. Yeah, that I think Black David will appreciate this. One of his favorite shows, Thunderbirds, back in the '60s when you were
Oh
born.
boy, that's the side. That's like the mirror version to the Thundercat.
It. The reason I want to bring that up, actually, that was around. It was going on for years, and that was like even in the '80s, but that was mostly puppets. And they
Mm.
I
actually,
know
I'm sorry.
the Thunderbird. I think the puppet was a British idea. Was it? Was it not?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
Super
not
Mario
sure.
Nation.
Kelly, do you know any chance?
No.
The
You're off.
Thunderbird was like a. The
I mean, the
Thunderbird was like a puppet. Yeah,
Thunderbirds were marionettes. I mean, that's what they
Yeah,
were.
yeah.
yeah, but it was a British idea of their own.
I don't know where
Well, yeah,
the
it's the
idea
yeah,
came from.
yeah, the guy who founded that was it Barry? What was who was the creator? I thought his name was Barry, but he ended it. But yeah, he had several. There were several series
Space
that
1999 was one of them.
Hmm.
yeah that came yeah, but that came that was like his first live action was actually UFO. So in fact, UFO the series. Space 1999 was supposed to be essentially season 2 of UFO, but they kind of scrapped it, and then they went with a totally different direction there. But the Thunderbirds, there were several. I think Stingray, whatever, a Fireball XL5, I think might have been like the first one, and then there were several marionette series over time. Thunderbirds was probably like the biggest out of all of them, and then since Thunderbirds, it started to kind of go down from there. Ironically, from what I understand, it went down because the marionettes got too good. See, when they had those giant heads, it was almost like there was like a suspension of belief that you just bought the characters as that. You just got into the story. But
So
when they
Paul, I'm
tried to
gonna cut
make
you
the
off really fast.
marionettes smaller,
So
then it became like people didn't buy it as much
yeah.
for some reason.
So I want to make this comment when we get back on topic. So they were going for a year off and on, off and on. The last one that did the best since the original marionettes was in 2015 to 2020. Actually, was stopped. So that was one of the most better ones they had. But let's get back on topic really fast. So my next question for I want to start with Kelly. Because I think you're gonna have a good answer on this one more than anybody. The difference between technology and special effect versus CGI. What do you think is better?
I mean, you can't argue against CGI, quite frankly, when it's done right and it's
Good luck
done
with that.
judiciously. Too much CGI is like too much green screen. You know, I think that the 80s was a great time period because you had these great fantastical ideas. You had a limited amount of what you could create, and so the rest of it had to be creatively created. And so when you can do anything by the stroke of a keyboard, it removes a lot of a lot of the creativity from the equation. So when, Jaws is a great example, right? The shark didn't work. So Spielberg had to figure out, how am I going to make a film about a damn shark attacking people when I can't even show the shark? And it made the movie better because he barely showed the shark until the end of the film.
Yeah.
Now, that was 75, right?
Yes. Yes.
By the time you get to the 80s, they've got the ability to do some more fantastical stuff, but they still can't do everything. They're not at the stage yet where they can do Jurassic Park, because that's in the 90s. It's 93. They're on the verge. They're on the cusp. So the stuff that they can't do, they still can't do. You have to come up with other creative ways to do it. You look at something like Beetlejuice, which was 80s. Excuse me. And one of the great things that they made, one of the great decisions that they made, they were towards the end of the 80s, and they had the ability to do some more CGI kind of things, but they went as practical as they possibly could to give it as much of a real world feel to this fantastical idea that they could. And I think that when you can do it all, it makes you just lazy. It makes you less likely to think about what's the coolest way I can show it when I can just show it all. And that's the thing that I think made the 80s stand out. By the time we got to the 90s, we got to the point where you're starting to get to the point where you can do whatever you think you want to do. And now today, you look out there and you see someone jumping off of an airplane. Like, the interesting thing about Tom Cruise, you see him jumping off of a cliff and parachuting in Mission Impossible 7. And it's him because you've seen all of the little videos. But at the end of the day, they could have slapped anybody's face on it. They could have been anybody doing it, and it could have looked like Cruise anyway. So you can't trust anything you see. In the 80s, there was still that balance between, wow, how'd they pull that off? And that's really cool. By the time you got to the 90s, the late 90s, they were like, well, they can make dinosaurs walk. They can do anything.
Good point. Paul, what about you?
The difference between special effects and CGI. I mean, I think certainly CGI is an umbrella under special effects. So special effects includes pyrotechnics, stunt work, stunt driving, all those different elements to make it work. So as long as you treat CGI as a tool in the arsenal, then certainly it could be effective. But if you rely on it too much, like I remember the Oppenheimer film, the director, he's really not a big fan of CGI. He wanted to, even for the Trinity test, he wanted that to be done mostly with pyrotechnics. He didn't want to have, the CGI was there to kind of do some touch-ups here and there, but he didn't want to do the whole scene in CGI. He wanted that sense of realism to it. So I certainly think that, when done now, again, certain things you just can't hack. Like you can't bring dinosaurs to life without going all CGI. It's just not. There's no animal that models them. Maybe unless you want to film an eagle or a chicken or something like that. But there's to get the basic movements right. But you can't model that. So for certain, but again, your mind goes to, okay, this isn't the more out of reality it is, the more I think of the CGI you can kind of get away with, because again, you're not dealing with human beings, you're dealing with aliens, you're dealing with monsters or dinosaurs or something like that. But when you're dealing with human beings, I think that has to has a fleshly quality to it. So you want to use as much real world as possible. But again, the 80s also brought you a lot more realistic special effects. I talked about earlier those transformation films like the Howling film or American Werewolf in London film, the transformation scenes, and you could tell the time. Like now, a CGI scene, the person turns into a werewolf almost instantly. But if you look at those films, those transformations were several minutes because they wanted you to really see the amount of work and detail that it took in order to bring that to life. And you were just enthralled in the scene, just watching every detail in terms of how it happened. So I think a lot of those films certainly put more work into the artistry of makeup, also makeups, the special effects regarding the animatronics back then, because you even saw it with the Star Wars reboots. Like the original Jabba the Hutt from 1983 was perfect. But when he came out with the special editions and he went to the CGI Jabba, I was like, what is that? I mean, when he had that deleted scene with Han Solo in the hangar, it looked awful. In fact, he had to do it like 2 or 3 times. So if you bought all like the sucker I was, I bought every Star Wars special edition I bought, even though it was like basically the same as the other one. But you could tell when he made those little tweaks with trying to get the CGI right. Same thing with Yoda. Again, the original Yoda was pretty good. But then once you got to the prequel series, it really wasn't until you got to the third one where they kind of got him right, because obviously he had to fight, with his lightsaber and stuff like that. So you saw him doing that. But really, for as much as I don't like the sequels, they essentially went back to the original Yoda concept in the last Skywalker, or whatever the last one was, where Yoda shows up and they burn the tree of wisdom or whatever. They went back like to the original model. So some things are, CGI doesn't necessarily enhance or hurt. That being said, there's a lot of 80s special effects that is dated. And you can tell but at the time, like if you watch Superman, like any of the Superman movies, Superman 1, Superman 2, or whatever, yeah, the flying sequences look dated. I mean, you could tell it just doesn't hold up to modern sensibilities. I talked about Firefox being one of my favorite Cold War films. The MiG-31 flying in the air, it doesn't look real. I always thought they should maybe go back and do a retouch of that. But now, having said that, again, going back to the Star Wars reboots, at the end when they had the X-wing battle at the Death Star, I thought that was a nice application of CGI, because they kept the core of the scenes the same, but they fleshed them out more. They made the battles look more real. The ship's movements look a lot more real. So again, it's a nice application of it. So it's going to be hit or miss either way. Some films, I think, you don't touch. Some, a nice touch up, clean up on the basic, not doing too much. I think that's a good application of it. So I hope I answered your question, but I think that certainly,
you're right to your opinion.
There's examples.
Coming up soon.
There's examples
but
from current films as well as
only
films in the
pushback
past.
I have before I put my opinion in, before Black David goes too, is George Lucas said he was not going to do the second one with Yoda the first time you ever see him fight without the CGI version of the Yoda.
Yeah,
Lucas thing, and then he
I mean, like I said, certain things like that you're going to need. But in the first two films, well, really the first film, he didn't look,
fake.
He didn't look that good. He did, when they tried to do the CGI on the
the second one, you mean, episode 2.
On the second, you're right, on the second one.
Mm-hmm.
But again, even with the first one, I guess they tried to make him look younger, so they went back. But he looked terrible. I mean,
but he was a puppy still in the first one.
But he looked terrible. Like he didn't even look like Yoda that much, except for the pointy
ears.
That's
your opinion. And I think he looked okay. It wasn't look that bad. Black David, you're up, my man.
Looking to both the two arguments, it got me looking back at how they were using CGI and special effects from the 80s to the 90s. And I have to agree with my fellow gentleman up here. The way they were using CGI back then was almost making them lazy, because they wasn't trying to reach a level of perfection. Now, me being wanting to be a horror movie critic, the storyline, the graphics, the scenery, it has to make sense. It has to feel like it's real. I remember watching Evil Dead series, or Nightmare on Elm Street series. When you look at these special effects and CGI, you can almost tell if it feel realistic or not. Now, if you're too anal on detail, you can catch on like, they could have done that better here. But at that time, the technology was new back then. Look at that now, how movies are being produced. It's almost like they lost the art of making a good story. What I'm seeing right now, because I compare with other movie arenas. You compare the American arena with the British arena, compare the British to the Indian arena, compare the Indian to the Asian arena, and you can tell a difference of who is actually taking the time to perfect the craft to make the movie look so realistic. Look, I'm not gonna lie, the 90s was the breakdoor entry whereby movies start to feel like it was real, but if you're so key to detail, you can see the flaws in a lot of movies, whereby you can see the reflection of the cameraman on some scene, like, for example, Leonardo DiCaprio, the Titanic. I caught on to that when I was young. I was I was like, you know how you rewind the movie back and forth, rewind the movie back and forth, you can see the mistake they make and they overlooked it. Because I used CGI to cover it to make sure it was not being shown. They didn't do that on that area.
Mhm.
Some of these I forgot one of my favorite werewolf movies. I forgot the one. The one in particular, they took the time to make it look realistically real, like actually what we're coming about,
Mhm.
compared to all the one I've seen before. And when you pay attention to the details, you could tell when it is off or it's not. I think that's what our problem when it comes to American movie theaters. When you watch a movie, I'm not gonna lie to you. I think after the late '90s, then people started to be aware of what was going on, and they didn't like the product they were seeing in the movie theater after that. Because some movie was overdone, they didn't take the time to perfect it. I think to me, my best movie I've seen in my life in the theater was Lord of the Rings, hands down, the whole entire series. Because it looked like they took their time to perfect their craft. And I always said when a movie take its time to be produced, it come out almost near perfect. But a movie being rushed just for the sake of getting to the box office, you can see some of the flaws here and there. So yeah, when you come to CGI and special effects, it's almost like they're not putting the emphasis of perfection compared to the Asian market. Asian market where you already know how it is. If it's not perfect, they will do that thing over and over and over until they get the perfect shot. And I get it. When I was listening to Mr. Paul Bennett argument and the gentleman, and I was listening to the detail, I was thinking about all these movies they mentioned, and I was like, wait a minute. I do remember the scenery. I do remember the art of it. And I was like, there'll be a time you be thinking, it was a good movie. But it could have been done better. The Star Wars series, I stopped watching it after the second, third installment. I could tell the difference. It was going off
Mhm.
what they agreed to do. And I was like, it doesn't. I hate it when you do a series, stay consistent. Don't do it dirty. It's like you're rushing just because of money. You're rushing because you have a deadline. No, take your time. Get it done right.
So here's my feedback, guys. I feel CGI is way overdone in any movie now. Like they will push so much CGI into it. But you got a couple movies. I'm gonna name three off my head right now. I can think of Star Wars, um, Aliens, and Back to the Future. All three of those age very well. Even to this day, you don't need to do any touch up, and they're fine the way they are. Why?
Like Star Wars, you mean the original from '77?
Yes, I think they age really well. That's my personal opinion. Again, you can argue with me
I
if
got
you
you.
want.
I got you. Right.
But I think they age really well. Even Back in the Future, let's use Back to the Future. They haven't done a special edition or touch up or anything. The way it is, it still looks really good. Obviously, you can tell it's from the '80s, obviously, because the clothes and everything. But virtual, graphics and all that stuff I think it's perfect. Go ahead, Kelly.
Um, I would agree with you, Pete. I was talking with a friend of mine earlier today in regards to this very topic, who is extremely knowledgeable when it comes to films.
You should bring him on next time.
And yeah, I've been talking to him about coming on. He's
warming up slowly.
He's great. He's great. He doesn't have the video set up to do it, but from his perspective, and I was surprised by his answer, but I agreed with it. He thought the quintessential film, if you wanted to take a film that just encapsulates the 80s, it's Back to the Future. It is a film that is incredibly well written, incredibly well scored, great special effects that hold up to this day, and it's tight. There's not a lot of fat on that film, and the story that it wants to tell, it tells it with economy, and also the sensibilities of the 80s. This hopefulness, the special effects, the stories that you couldn't tell just 10 years earlier because of the need for special effects that now you could. And I have to tell you, I like the original Back to the Future is one of my favorite films of all time, and I have a tough time debating that. I might go for Empire Strikes Back, but he argues that although it came out in '80, it's really a '70s film, and I don't know that I disagree with that in and of itself, but for me, it's Back to the Future, it's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Empire Strikes Back are the quintessential fantasy escapist films of the '80s that created this. When you look back now, this time capsule of what was great about that era, and those three films I think are that. And when you talk about Back to the Future, man, it's hard to argue against it.
Yeah. Well, I do want to mention one honorable mention film, not an '80s film, but if you want to talk about film where the special effects still hold up, I still got to give credit to 2001: Space Odyssey.
You're going back to the '60s, Paul.
I said exception. We're off topic.
I'm just saying,
way back. A film
I agree 100%.
I can watch that film 100 times, and it still has this sense of realism to it.
There's no
ships, the stations, the everything. And this is when you didn't even have computers, really. You didn't have any kind of computer, very limited computer animation at the time. And the fact they were able to pull it off, and 50-something years later, 55 years later, 56 years later after it came out, it still holds up. It's still, I'm enthralled every time I watch it.
Paul, if you look at that film, and then you look at a film that came out after that, the great Russian film Solaris, right? And you look at the special effects of that film,
right? It
just makes you that much more enamored with 2001. I mean, you're right. 2001. There's no doubt. It holds up. It looks great. They
haven't had to touch it. They had every opportunity.
They've never had to touch it.
There's nothing to touch because it's weird. Like the suits that they're in, the pods, the way that things move. You look at go to NASA.com and look at anything involving the space shuttle or anything space. It's relevant. It's like
I'm with you. I'm with you 100%.
But to your question, Pete, that might be the greatest special effects film of all time.
Which one?
CGI or no CGI, because over 50 plus years, it still holds up.
Which movie was it again?
2001: A Space Odyssey, 1968.
Certainly for the time period. And I think you go from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I think the next film you have to say is Jurassic Park in '93. Yeah. I mean, you go back and look at Jurassic Park now and talk about a master's class in how do you incorporate real world special effects and CGI. And why did they have to do it the way they did? Why did they do what they did in Jurassic Park? Is because they still couldn't do everything they wanted CGI wise. And so there was an economy of CGI, and it made the filmmaker have to be smarter. And I mean, it's still to this day, the T-Rex attack sequence and the velociraptors in the kitchen.
I'll never forget.
You can't get a better sequence.
I'll never forget when I was in the theater. For some reason, now we got seats towards the front. For some reason, some stupid parents had their kids like in the first 4 rows. And when that attack happened, these kids screamed and cried so loud. They were literally traumatized, which made the whole experience, like more traumatizing because the kids were so freaked out by it. But they were scared out of their minds. They didn't take the kids out. They kind of got to it. They were literally,
That was the meaning. That's what it's meant to be.
I get it. But don't have the kids so far up in the front row.
No, you know what was good that way? Because I'm sure the director had that in mind. What kind of dumb parent will have the gall? The first 4 rows.
I want to know why would you bring your kid to that movie? That's my first question.
No, I don't. Kids love dinosaurs. No, I don't mind. Right. I knew the kids would gravitate, but
how would it make the movie to make them pee on themselves? That if I were the director, I would make sure my movie make a lot of kids pee on themselves. When they take the first 4 rows.
You're fucked up, dude.
Yeah, that was like, but they didn't move the kids. The kids are like screaming and crying, like especially when the T-Rex comes through the roof of the truck
and gets the
glass.
But guess what?
Totally.
When the kids scream, everybody else scream along with them because they feel the effects of it.
Oh my gosh!
So
It was almost like they're doing the kids as an
before we get too far off topic.
the theater hired the kids. We need some screaming kids in here to make the ambience better.
But let me be
Before we get
honest,
off topic, hang on a second. Which one you guys think is the worst CGI?
Evil Dead.
Of what?
And just movie wise, obviously, I'm talking about.
Evil Dead.
The worst CGI?
I got you guys are never gonna answer the right question. I'm thinking. I think you guys are gonna. I'm gonna outbeat all 4 or 3 of you guys tonight.
There's been a lot of bad CGI. I think for the time,
top one, in my opinion. You want to hear it?
Yeah.
Power Rangers, when they did the Megazord, the CGI was the worst I ever seen.
But you know what?
I know it's not 80s,
No. Listen, here's the thing. When you talk about the worst CGI, you have to put it in context of the time period and the expectations, right? So for me, one of the worst, I don't know if it's the worst, but one of the worst is I Am Legend. Will Smith.
The zombies weren't that.
Yeah.
The zombies at the end were just so incredibly bad for the
a lot of
the
those
epic nature of the film, the budget of the film, the expectations of the film. You're doing a remake of
Omega Man, right?
Omega Man.
Yeah.
You gotta bring that home. And I get it. Look, did they look better than the disco vampires of the 70s? Yes, they did. But it's so bad. It takes you out of the film during those moments. And it's in the Power Rangers, you expect it not to be that great.
But here's the problem: the Power Ranger, there are 2 versions. So you gotta give respect. They would have learned the hard way. The Power Ranger we saw in the U.S. were nothing more than a watered-down version of the Power Ranger they were showing in Japan.
Right.
But not the Hollywood version, not the Hollywood movie that they put together.
The Hollywood was more like crap to me.
Yeah,
that's what we're talking about. The
But
Hollywood movie.
when I started watching the Japanese versions, and I was looking at, I'm like, hold up. I said, why is it so way better storyline? Even I gotta go to the subtitle, I could care less about the subtitle. I'm enjoying it, and better grab. I was like, you know what? This is the problem. When it comes to Japanese product, it's all about perfectionism. They want to be perfect in any era they're in.
Well, they trust their audience too. I mean, their whole audience has grown up with this stuff, and in the United States, when you put suits in charge, we don't have the sensibility to understand the adult nature of what that was. When suits look at it and they go, "Oh, guys who transform and they've got the ability to create big things that fight. Oh, it must be for kids. Oh, this isn't dumbed down enough. This isn't kid friendly enough. This isn't kid-esque enough." And then they have to just destroy it. They've done it. They've done it forever with Japanese films.
Right.
And Kelly's right. They destroyed the series. Like even when they came out, Power Ranger Turbo movie, the second movie.
Right.
That one, it was half false too, and it wasn't as bad as the first one. I give them that. I'm just curious how Netflix is going to take the series now, because they were supposed to be doing a whole reboot, a whole brand new start from scratch. They wiped the whole thing. I think it's a bad idea personally.
Power Rangers?
Yeah, Netflix has the right to it. They bought the rights. They own it.
Interestingly, they may do a better job.
Did they buy the right to redo Power Ranger, or did they buy the right to do certain Power Ranger?
No, they own everything now.
You sure about that? Because no Power Ranger. But here what I'm talking. And you know what I want to know? Because here's the thing: they're still doing Power Ranger in Japan, but they don't call it Power Ranger.
I know that's different. I'm talking about the United States version here in America. They own the rights to it now.
I would say
The
don't
tweak of
try.
time.
Don't just.
You know,
I'll
you're
say
saying,
don't try. Give it up.
yeah.
They'll
Go ahead,
probably
Kelly.
do a better job with the Power Rangers version of Netflix than they do of the Avatar version of Netflix.
Hold on.
Because the Power Ranger version of Netflix is going to be slightly better than what you expect, while the Avatar version is slightly worse than what you hoped.
Let me tell you why I said hold on to that one. Because for one, I'm still pissed at the fact that when Netflix took over my favorite iconic cartoon called Voltron, they made it woke. And I'm still pissed to this day.
Okay,
So don't
hang
get
on.
me
Yeah.
Okay, which one?
Yeah,
Because
there's
they-
a lot
they
of that
do
going
two
around.
versions.
No,
The Voltron Force, then the Voltron.
the latest Voltron they had on Netflix
Oh,
got
that's
woke.
there was like what 5 years was there on 5 seasons?
It was, it was a multiple series, and there was the whole series. Then there was a multiple season. But toward to the end, I got real pissed. It felt like the Legend of Korra Part 2 to me.
Can't argue with a man for once, and that's kind of this surprising. It comes to him. I'm like,
Because
here's
you don't
another
thi-
one that he
you
screwed up pretty bad
you,
too. A
you,
reboot
you,
was
you don't take my
Thundercats.
you don't take my no Thundercat from Cartoon Network. The latest one they did before the Thundercat Go was really good. It had a better storyline. It was spread out a little bit further, and you can expand upon it. But the problem is, all because of toys, sir, I say F you, Cartoon Network, F you.
Mhm.
The way why people are walking away from cartoon and going to anime, they got sick and tired. There's no consistency behind their products.
Mhm.
What I'm getting sick and tired of, because I think American,
See, when it comes to kids stuff, Power Rangers, anime, anything like that, if the toys don't sell, they're not gonna continue making this stuff. Kelly, if I'm wrong, please tell me.
yeah, but how would a toy will sell if it's not matching to the storyline or what they're putting out there?
I I have no idea, to be honest
That's
with you.
poor marketing. That's what I'm saying. It's not. They're not about perfection. They're about they get the money quick.
Mm.
That's the problem.
All right, let's.
I got a couple. A
Go
couple more
ahead.
thoughts on the special effects thing. I mean, one there is an economy. I think it was mentioned earlier. There is an economy that has become cheaper to do CGI. Like remember back in the day, they were using those RISC computers. I mean, like David, you may know about this. Like if you want to do like an hour of CGI, it would take like 2 or 3 days to render, even with your fastest RISC computers from back in the day.
Yeah, you're
So
right.
it was expensive.
But
Now
now,
they can
oh,
turn it over very quickly. So when you look at CGI versus like traditional special effects, the money from a budgeting point of view, which is obviously if you're producing a film, that's something you do have to take in mind. There might have been almost an equal in terms of do I. So again, that's why you probably did as much special effects, pyrograph techniques, and things like that versus CGI because of the cost. But certainly, since computing has become more and more, it's become cheaper over time, I think a lot of people have
and
leaned
more
on it because of the cost.
advanced.
Because think about it, if you're going to set up a
That's a
big
good
end
point.
pyrotechnic scene, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of
Yeah.
takes, and you got to get the take done like in like one take. So it
Mhm.
takes weeks to film and whatnot. So I think certainly we can't discount the economy of the situation. That's why CGI is being used more because of just the cost. And you know not everyone's getting $100 million, $200 million budget to do a film. So I think those are decisions that are made. Some are good, some are bad. But
Yeah,
I
I
did
think
want
you
to
have
talk
a good
about a
point there,
couple.
Paul.
Yeah, I
So
did want to talk about a couple. Yeah,
let me finish with the last question, and we'll go to hear
sure,
our final thoughts. Writing.
sure.
What's your guys' opinion? How do you guys feel like the writings between the 80s and now? I think I know the answer, but I want to hear your guys' opinions. Kelly, go first.
Writing. Well, I think from a comedy standpoint, there's no. I don't think any other decade can touch it. I think that they understood comedy. They understood how to write a scene. They had understood how to write an entire story. So much of what you see now in comedy is it's a good skit, or it was an idea of a skit that they turn into an entire film, as opposed to I have a funny idea for a film, and here are these are the skits that I'm going to put in it. You look at Breakfast Club as a prime example of it. It straddles the line between drama and comedy. Fast Times at Ridgemont High I mean, you can go on and on as far as the 80s are concerned. Once again, can you quote a movie? How many comedies can you quote to this day that don't involve Will Ferrell and Ron Burgundy? Like, how many of them can you quote? There's not a lot of them. But you go back to the 80s and there's one after the other. Dramas, sci-fi, they're copying what they did in the 80s now because the 80s had the originality. You had E.T. Where the hell did E.T. come from? Back to the Future. All of the aliens. I mean, it goes on and on and on as far as films are concerned. Ghostbusters, for God's sakes. E.T. Top Gun came out during that period of time, which arguably is not one of the best written films, but one of the best produced films of all time. So from a writing standpoint, I think that, do you get a more gritty, a more realistic take today? Yeah, probably so. But does it make it a better story, a more compelling story, a more compelling character? I argue not. Look at Stand By Me. It's one of those films. It's just one of those seminal works that just works. Stand By Me, to me, is the equivalent of the 90s, Shawshank Redemption, right? Just one of these films that I don't know anybody who watched Stand By Me and who didn't like it. I don't know anybody who's ever watched Shawshank Redemption didn't like it. It's just a incredibly well-written film. Driving Miss Daisy. Sophie's Choice, for God's sakes, came out during the 80s, right? So, I mean, a lot of great films. But from a writing standpoint, you could argue that, if you like grittier, more in-depth, longer films, well, maybe you like today better. But for me, I'll take the 80s.
To me, I would take the 80 and a more piece of the 90s because, like I said, America have lost their creativity. Don't know how to be original anymore. Look at the fact that we had to remake a masterpiece of a movie called Dooms. I remember watching Doom back in the day, and now look at Doom now. They're trying to expand it more into two movies. But I understand why they were doing that. Lord of the Rings. I remember watching the cartoons animated series back then. Look what they did right now. They perfected it, even though it's based on the book. But for what I'm seeing, there's not a desire to create a good story. A lot of power connected, a lot of small special effect just to sell a movie, but no good storyline. I'm like, what the hell?
One good point in regards to that, just something else that I forgot to mention, is the fact that, today, too much agenda drives the story, as opposed to the story creates an agenda.
Amen. Now, what I'm pissed off with the lady Voltron. They made it woke. Then every other childhood story that you watch back in our day, the time we make it and try to put a little wokeism in it, I'm done with this. Like, if you're gonna do that, I'm not gonna move to Japan and enjoying their stuff. Because right now, I hate to say it, America don't have a market right now. They're spoiling everything they put their finger on. The Japanese movie theaters are coming out with originality left and right. Like they got books piled up that they haven't touched yet. Oh yeah, let's work on this part. We did it 20 years ago. Now we got the time to do it. Let's work on this one right now. Why you think the anime scene is like a huge following globally because it's based on storytelling? America walked away from storytelling, trying to tell a great story, into just sell your movie because you have a well-known actor, put a bunch of fireworks, a bunch of special effects, some fight scene that don't make no sense, and we sell just like that. Make a quick bucks. Really? Come on. The 80s and then a little of the 90s was the best era in America right now. Right now, I'm not sure if I want to go to the theater unless I'm sure they'll produce a real good movie and they take their time working on it. You're going to produce a good movie? Take at least a year. I had to say, they did Lord of the Rings. Every Lord of the Rings movie took them a year to produce. And it's almost close to perfect. Only thing anyone can argue with me, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Look at the consistency behind that. You can't argue with me that they didn't take that time to make sure they come out perfectly, even though it's based on a book. It's supposed to be a remake book. It was done well compared to other movies. I'm yet to see a great storytelling movie to this day that could compete with the 80s and a little of the 90s. That's what I'm going to say.
Well,
I might be a little contrarian here, because I don't think as far as the writing, I don't think you had to work as hard in the 80s because the period itself gave you material to write on. I keep going back to that theme. The 80s was like the Big Bang. You had so much social upheaval, the technical changes, the fears of those changes, what drove all those, computers take over the world sort of thing. That all happened in the 80s. Shall we play a game?
Would you like to play a game?
Yeah, I mean it was there. So the times, if you couldn't come up with stuff to write about in that time, shame on you. I mean, we used to read good science fiction back. Remember, you guys remember that magazine Omni magazine? I mean, that was like that was a great sci-fi magazine from like back in the day where you got a lot of original content and of story writers and whatnot, because a lot of it was futuristic and a lot of it dealt with where things are going. You had a lot of speculators in terms of where things were going. So if the times didn't get your creative juices flowing, I don't know if anything would. Now, regards to the comedies that Kelly talked about earlier, I'm sorry, I got to give a lot more credit to the people of that era. You grew up basically in like the kings of comedy, not the black kings of comedy era, but the king. You had Robin Williams, you had Billy Crystal, you had Whoopi Goldberg. I mean, you had like this funny people, even comedy itself. I mean, think about today's comedy. How many comedians that you could just think of off the top of your head that are funny that you would watch? I could think of Bill Burr and maybe Chris Rock, and basically that's it.
Bill Burr.
But back then, you had comedian after comedian where it didn't matter with Eddie Murphy.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Savants. I mean, look at the original SNL, right? The crew that
came out during that time period.
Right. I'm saying the 70s SNL crew and the early 80s SNL crew, which is still arguably the greatest of the bunch. I mean, we can argue and debate. I like some of the guys from the late 90s and early 2000s, but we can.
What about Living Color?
That was barely. I would say that's almost 90s, but I'll give you that. It was 89. I think that's more 90s than 80s. But I'm just saying, you had such a proliferation of talented, funny people. Their stand-ups. Robin Williams, my gosh. I mean, he defined the 80s in terms of a comedic. I remember from his Mork and Mindy days back in the late 70s on Happy Days.
Yeah, you're right.
So who out there today is funny like that? I mean, Kevin Hart is not that. I've never found Kevin Hart funny ever.
No, correction. Kevin Hart is not funny. He just looks funny.
Okay. I'm just saying.
Chris Rock is not funny. He just sounds funny.
Right, but I'm just saying the talent of those people. It was hard to make a bad film. And remember those 80s films, 48 Hours, right? With Eddie Murphy. I mean, Roxanne, you don't have to put out the red light. I mean, so these guys were so good that they could work almost anything and make it good back then. Even their bad movies were relative. The Golden Child, or
hold on, Paul. I would say the early Cat Win was funny. Not the dude.
But you don't have. I'm talking about the abundance. And again, even funny, like you don't say things to be funny, for laughs. Like everything is kind of like either, like just pessimistic, kind of like angry at the world type of stuff. Robin Williams would have you laughing. These comedians had you. Billy Crystal, you would laugh because it was fun. Like it was like everything now is like everything sucks, right? Even Bill Burr, who I like, most of his stuff is just he's just angry all the time.
He's not funny to me. Bill Burr is not funny.
Yeah, but I'm just saying. But I think he's funny. But I'm saying a lot of his shtick is all about how he's pissed off at everything. Even though you're multimillionaire and you got all these project stuff going on, but you still want to you just want to sell that. Okay, everything's wrong with the world and everyone annoys you. You know. But
what about
so,
More Mooney?
What's that?
What about More Mooney?
Who?
I forgot Mooney. I forgot his name.
Paul Mooney.
Paul Mooney. Yeah.
No, he goes back to the 70s, man. I mean, but even then, you had Paul Mooney, Richard Pryor. You had oh my gosh, the guy with the beard. Oh my gosh, he's probably one of the best. George Carlin. I mean, you had heavy hitters. I mean, the goats of comedy in that time, in the 70s, in the 80s, when it came out with stuff. It was, I mean, so it was almost easy to write for those people because it was really, you were selling them. It was almost like the writer would say, get out the way and let these people do their thing.
Don't it was also a component of, back at that time, you wrote a beginning, a middle, and end to a skit. Like, even if you look at, Saturday Night Live, today, in the 90s, 2000s, I mean, it started slipping away in the 90s, but in the 2000s and beyond, it became, I've got a little idea, and, you try to throw it out there, and the idea itself is funny, but they don't know how to finish the story because it's all short attention span theater.
But at the
all these people have been raised on this short attention span. Got to move on to the next thing. Well,
what happened to the improv? Again, a lot of those guys, a lot of the lines, you talked about the famous lines from these films. A lot of those lines were ad-libbed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the people they were geniuses. They knew what sounded right or whatever, and they had to go back and forth with it. So again, to their question about the writing, I can only give so much to the writing because of the times. It was easier to write. And the people, the characters, the actors, the comedians, it was about making them shine. Put them in front of a camera and have them do their thing. Give them the basic outline of what the scene is and let them go. Don't even give them a script, and they're gonna land the plane on this thing. You don't have that today with a lot of these projects today. So again, the 80s in terms of creativity, even the music. Who's writing good songs today?
None.
Back then, I mean, Thriller. Pick your album. Pick your the topics. Video killed the radio star. Whatever songs of the 80s. We can have a separate show on songs of the 80s, the music of the 80s. We can have that show. And the creativity then. So I'm just saying. So I think we give a lot of credit to that era. But I think a lot of it has to do with the era and the people who were involved in the era. They're amongst the best, and I don't think those people will be replaced. Robin Williams would never be replaced. Billy Crystal, all those, George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Paul Mooney, all those legends from back in the day. I don't think we'll ever see the likes of those guys again. That will actually have you thinking and have you laughing at the same time. I think that era almost in comedy is almost gone. Now everything is about insult and everything's about anger and grievance, and nobody is like, you walk away from the comedy show angry more so than happy because you've been entertained. It's just a different time today.
No, you got me thinking about a lot of things. I was thinking about the other two that might come to my mind is Jimmy Fox and Martin Lord when they do stand-up comedy. And I wonder,
those guys haven't done stand-up in like 20, 30 years.
I know, because I remember watching Jimmy Fox stand-up comedy. I thought something was wrong there because the way he was putting his joke together, it was funny, but I couldn't hold my laughter when he started making fun of African people, how he was saying that we stole our dancing from the African more original. He started doing some of these stupid things. I said, tell me wrong with Jimmy Fox.
But a lot of guys say, but they never do today. See, those guys back in the 80s, they stayed in the clubs. They stayed performing. Today, it's almost like you're almost afraid to go and perform in front of a comedy club because, again, everything, especially with social media, everyone's like, okay, he bombed. he or she bombed in the club or whatever, oh, we can't put him in the next film. But back then, you maintain your craft just like anything else, just like the martial arts. Unless you're in the dojo, unless you're putting to the grind,
you're right because I
so
remember
comedians have to stay in the clubs.
I'm glad you're right. You're right about it. Because Cat Wayne did say that a lot of the comedians cannot hold a comedy club.
So my buddy CQ, I mentioned him before earlier today. He does those stand up, and he has told me a lot of times he's in the middle of stand up and crickets. It's his job to find different jokes to make the people laugh. I've been at what's it called stand up Fluffy when he was in Allentown last summer. Two of his stand ups before him, one he was best friend with some other guy, crickets. But when he came in, everybody was laughing. So it happens sometimes. It just it's part of the game, unfortunately.
But now everybody's got cameras and everyone could film your stuff and everyone can post it online.
That's
so
the thing,
again,
there was no cameras allowed out. You could get kicked out.
Yeah.
They were watching like hawks there about that. But my opinion about this is, I think both have good storylines. I think 80 has the best, obviously, in my opinion. But I do think in the 90s, early 2000s, and 2010s, and so on, you can put some good ones in there too. But if they take their time and not rush it. Like, I give you a great example. Transformers and Ninja Turtles, when they rebooted the series, they rushed the second movies, both of them. They have pushed them out so fast. So let's get final thoughts and let's get out of here. We got things to do.
Transformer movie was trash all the way through.
Which
I'm
one?
just gonna say that. All of it.
Yeah. Kelly, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. 80s. 80s live today because the 80s films. I mean, you think of any movie that you've seen in the last 10 years, and you tell me that 20 years from now you're still going to be talking about movie, and I beg to differ.
Black Dude?
I think my final thought was the Transformer movie series is trash. Right now, the only redemption they have right now is this Transformer 1, hoping they'll do it right the first time.
That's actually a CG movie more than a movie.
Even though it's CG, we all grew up in watching Transformers. It was more about robot interaction than robot with the human interaction. And some of the unnecessary joke they had in Transformer was unnecessary. I'm sorry, I'm a tough critic.
I have one even worse than that in a minute. I can hear you go, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Paul, go ahead.
No worse than that, G.I. Joe.
Nope, hang on. Wait for my turn.
Look, the 80s, those were my formative years. That was my come of age years. It was arguably the most challenging time of my life, but also the funnest time of my life, the greatest relief from my personal struggles growing up in that time was the movies and the music and the culture, the gaming, everything of that era that I'm still fond of today. My favorite genre of music, more than likely, is still 80s movies. I have a lot of 80s movies in my collection still that I can go back to at any time. And it was just a great period. And I don't think such a period will be replicated again in the future. But definitely my favorite genre of entertainment. Because even professional wrestling, again, Hulkamania, that era of professional wrestling back then, NWA, WWF.
The Attitude Era.
That came later. That was the 90s. I'm just saying, but the 80s with Hulkamania, and like I said, the NWA, Ric Flair, those guys, before Turner brought them out in '88. Again, just great times, great. Just to kind of get away from it all. Great escapism in the 80s for that period. And even to this day, like I said, I watch very little of today's wrestling, but you can catch me almost at any time on YouTube watching World Championship Wrestling from June of 1987 or 86 or whatever, and watching those shows from back in the day. So I still love professional wrestling. I'm not as much of a fan of sports entertainment, but I certainly remember those times with fondness.
Mr. Paul, let me give you an update. Paul Entertainment is completely gone.
Yeah, they're
After
not there now.
a-
They're at the
after the scandal with Vince
Mhm.
McMahon, Paul Levesque, aka Triple H, brought back the era of professional wrestling because they had to do that because AEW was carrying the banner of professional wrestling and
Mhm.
they don't want to be left behind. So it's now in the competition of who have the best professional wrestling products right now so
yeah.
far.
Now they're in a different era, the Paul Levesque era. But my turn now. Um, I think 80s have a lot of good movies. I'm not gonna deny it. I think they're listen. I can go on and on, but there's some bad ones too. But that's the sweet part about 80s. They were inventions. They were the first ones to think about it. I think they're always going to hold place in even when we're in 300s. When we get 3000s or whatever. Later on, I think there people will come back to them and use them as a reference. But like I promised Black David, I got one show that became a movie that was really bad. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Yet in the 80s. Anime
He-Man.
comedy. Dude, worse than that.
Ooh.
The Guyver.
Oh yeah.
Told you
It was
I got
bad.
one.
It was really bad.
So, Kelly, I'm actually one. I don't think you remember this one. They had an anime called The Guyver. Really good anime. It was very popular over there. But when they brought it here, it was pretty. It had a good following.
The Guyver, the bio weapon uniform, bio weapon suit.
Yes. So when
They
they
did a
converted
they
to a
did
movie. The first movie
Here's the
was
problem.
bad. The second one was
The
even worse.
the first series of that one was done all right, and they did a remake of the remake was kind of done a pretty much better, but
I haven't seen
there
the
was an
remake. I only
itch.
saw the original.
I've seen the remake of it, and it was done better. The problem is there was a conflict concerning the direction how they want to go further with the
Of
production of
course.
the
So why
studio.
wouldn't? Why
So
not everybody put their hand in a pot and let this guy do his
I
job?
think that's the problem right now. There's a lot of old anime they want to remake, but there's an argument on what direction they want to take, and that take almost for a year to squash.
Yeah.
That's
So,
how bad it is.
schedule update, guys, really fast. Tomorrow, gray area. Me and Paul will be here at 9:30. Here on the BMU channel. We're talking about college. The difference between here and Greece. Big difference. So, also we have on Wednesday the journey of self-destruction and rebuilding yourself. 9:30 Spartan Arena. Then, on top of that, you ready for the one, Paul? You're gonna like this one. Next week, we are talking about hair versus baldness.
Oh no, I'm staying out of that mess.
Oh, no, you're coming in that one. I don't give a shit. I'm dragging you out.
Then until you get your other guys on, then that's So I'm gonna have to take on the room pretty much because I'm looking at you three right now. So I'm already
He's half
outnumbered.
bald. Kenny's half bald. Yours not half. He hides it.
Half bald.
Yeah, he hides it.
But then I would encourage you to make I would encourage you to make the full commitment. Don't be double minded and go all in and close the door and don't go back to it. So
every time I go visit my
Barber.
my hairstylist, I ask her, "Is it time to go? Is it time to shave it?" And she says no. And I'm sure it's not because she's just taking my dollars every couple of weeks.
Bingo.
Take your dollars every couple of weeks.
So
Bingo.
Kelly, did we
Has
ever
nothing
tell
to
you,
do with it. It's because she loves what I have still left up here.
Kelly,
She's
did
milking
we
those
ever tell
dollars.
you why
You could
we
buy yourself a
call-
head shaver, a 5-head, 6-head
No,
shaver
it doesn't have anything to do with that at all.
for a few $40. And
It wouldn't matter. I wear a hat 95% of my time. So if I'm bald or if I'm not bald, it doesn't matter.
let
So,
your head
Kelly,
shine.
Kelly,
We have a
hang
we have a
on.
ball man. You got a ball headed club.
Hang on. Kelly, did we ever tell you why we call Paul Mr. President?
I just assumed he was elected in a
No. Mr.
democratically
Would
elected.
you like to introduce yourself really fast to Kelly?
First of all, I am the president of the bold and the beautiful, the beneficent, benevolent ball brotherhood of the BMU, the Black Man Unfiltered Network. So I encourage my brothers all ethnic groups to embrace baldness. We don't need the Sherman Hemsley. We don't need the ponytail in the back with the bald on. Again, live follicle free. You will save money. You will liberate the thoughts. The as intelligent as you are, the brain, the thought process just comes when you're not limited by here. How many men have wasted thousands and thousands of dollars on hair care products or over time? I mean, so I'm trying to
thousands and thousands of dollars on hats.
How many? That too, but I'm trying to liberate men to be their free selves and just live the ball lifestyle. Again, you get up in the morning, you don't have to worry about styling. How much your time back in the day? I spent years. I had waves in my hair like the whole time. I did the do-rag thing for all those years. How much time did I waste? How many, probably millions of brush strokes that I wasted over time trying to hold on to something that, at the end of the day. So again, when we have iconic figures like Yul Brynner and Louis Gossett Jr., rest in peace, another great 80s actor, rest in peace to Louis Gossett Jr.
Michael Jordan.
Yes, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, the NBA players. Look at Patrick Stewart, one of the great ones.
Right,
Charles Xavier from the X-Men. I mean, Professor X.
Engage. Yes. Make it so.
Yes, exactly. Yul Brynner, the original OG. He was the original one who made baldness cool.
Paul, I would argue that when it comes to fashion and just getting yourself ready to go out the door, I don't even have to worry about if my head's stubbly. I just put the hat on, buddy. I just put the hat on. And I would send out to all of my brothers, regardless of racial standing or the size of their head, wear a hat, dude. Just wear a hat.
Well, obviously, look, we don't want guys getting sunburned out there. So obviously, you need to wear a hat for protection.
That's right. In these spaces, keep it low, man. Keep it low.
In the comfort of your home and room temperature and everything there, let the follicles free. Let it go, man. So you can express yourself to the fullest. So I'm trying to get these guys. Grooming tried it once, and that he had his best content when he was bald. And since he's going it back, it's been kind of going down a little bit. So
yeah, I got you. I did have a friend of mine. My friend was black, and he used to tell me all the time. He goes, "You know why I wear a hat?" I said, "No." He goes, "Because when I walk into a place, I want to be able to go like this and put it up. Because I've noticed a difference. When my hat's up like this, people look at me and think I'm friendly. I can't have my hat down like this. I can't have it turned backwards because I get all the weird looks. But if I just put the hat up nice and, so like if you're bald, man, there's no hat you can put up like this.
All right, we'll keep this
one. You can't do it.
All right, guys.
You have a beautiful forehead, by the way. I'm just saying.
With the perfect forehead for baldness.
This is show up, guys. All right, this was Grooming Reviews. I am Ghost of Sparta. He's Mouth. He's Mr. President. He's Black David. As always, stay fresh, stay safe.